Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 2008. The US is deep in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Army is, well, it's grappling with a type of conflict it had never really seen before. So how do you even begin to plan for a future that's this uncertain? Well, if you're the US Army, you commission a report, and that's what we're going to dig into today. One of the most influential forecasts from that time, a deep dive into what everyone was calling the Long War. So this right here, this is the actual document we're breaking down. It was put together for the Army by the RAND Corporation, which is a major think tank. They were basically asked to map out the whole landscape of this new global struggle. You know, what was motivating it, where was it headed, what did it all mean? Looking at this document now gives us a really fascinating peek into how strategists were thinking back then. All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll talk about why this whole idea of a long war was such a big deal. Then, we'll look at the pretty unique framework RAND came up with to make sense of it all. After that, we'll get into the 8 wild possible futures they imagined, the playbook of strategies they built to respond, and finally, what all of this really meant for the boots on the ground, the US Army. Okay, so first things first, we have to get our heads around this concept of a war without end. And to do that, you really have to put yourself back into the mindset of the mid-2000s. I mean, this was a time totally defined by the aftermath of 9/11 and the wars that followed. And look, this wasn't just some catchy slogan that people were throwing around. This was official US doctrine. This exact line comes from the Pentagon's big strategy document in 2006. It basically cemented the term long war into the minds of every military planner. It was a signal that this wasn't about winning a single battle or even a war in one country. This was going to be a generational struggle. And that is the million-dollar question, right? If you're told you're fighting a long war, you're going to want to know, what is it exactly? And where is this all going? Is it a war on terror? Is it some kind of clash of civilizations? Or is it something else entirely? Answering that was the whole point of the RAND report. So that brings us to the real analytical core of this report, what they called the GTI framework. RAND basically said, look, to understand the long war, you need a totally new way of looking at the problem. See, instead of focusing on a single enemy, RAND framed the whole thing as this intersection of 3 big overlapping challenges. This model, which looks like a simple Venn diagram, really became the foundation for everything else they did in the report. So what's GTI? It stands for governance, terrorism, and ideology. And here was RAND's big idea. The long war wasn't really about any one of these things. It was about that dangerous spot right in the middle, where they all come together. It's where a powerful ideology gives people the motivation to use the tactic of terrorism in places where governance is weak or doesn't even exist. The report then gets really specific about the I in GTI, the ideology that was driving things at the time, Salafi jihadism. They described it as this kind of hybrid belief system that totally rejects the modern world and uses concepts like jihad or holy struggle and takfir, which is declaring other Muslims to be infidels to justify violence. So once they had this GTI framework, RAND did something pretty ambitious. They used it as a lens to game out all the different ways the future could play out. And that brings us to their 8 possible futures. And here they are. Just look at the sheer range of possibilities they put on the table. You've got everything from a steady state, which is kind of just more the same, to some really dramatic shifts. For example, major Muslim nation goes bad, or a holding action, or a conflict with a major power like China could force the US to completely shift its focus. Let's just put 2 of these side by side to see how crazy different they are. In one scenario, you've got a nightmare situation where a nuclear-armed country like Pakistan falls to extremists. In another, a totally different kind of crisis, a conflict with a major competitor, forces the US to basically put the long war on the back burner. I mean, how do you even begin to prepare for both of those futures at the same time? Well, that's exactly where the next part of the report comes in. Because you have this huge menu of possible futures, RAND developed a matching menu of strategies. This is their 7 strategy playbook. And the key thing to remember here is that there wasn't supposed to be one single silver bullet solution. The idea was that military planners needed a whole toolkit with lots of options they could mix and match for any situation that came up. 7 of them. So this is the playbook they came up with, and it covers a ton of ground. At one end, you have a really aggressive strategy called inside out. You can think of that as regime change, kind of like the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Then way on the other end, you have a much more defensive posture, contain and react, which is basically holding the line. And then you have all these options in between, like tackling the underlying causes, like poverty, using classic counterinsurgency inkblot tactics to clear and hold territory, or even more covert options, like divide and rule. Let's just zoom in on that last one for a second. This quote really shows you the cold, hard logic behind some of this thinking. The idea with divide and rule is to use things like covert action and information warfare to literally get jihadist groups to turn against each other, to make them spend their energy fighting each other instead of fighting the US. Pretty provocative stuff, but it was absolutely on the table. Okay, so we've got the problem, we've got the possible futures, and we've got the strategic playbook. So let's get to the bottom line here in our last section. What did this all actually mean for the US Army? You know, the people who would have to go out and do this stuff. The big takeaway for the Army was this. It needed a massive mental shift. It wasn't enough to just prepare for big tank battles anymore. Now, it had to understand governance, terrorism, and ideology. And maybe the biggest shock in the report was the warning that the Army's core belief that major combat was its main job was now, and I'm quoting, vulnerable. Things like stability operations and nation building had to be taken just as seriously. And that kind of leaves us with one final big question to think about. This was all written in 2008, but the decade that came after saw the rise of ISIS, the Arab Spring, the Syrian Civil War, and then this big pivot back toward competing with countries like Russia and China. So looking back on it now, how well did this forecast actually hold up? What did it get right, and what did it completely miss? That's a good one to chew on.